Chapter 34. The next morning, Friday, September 2nd, I hobbled into my first class on my crutches at 8:50 a.m. I had decided to show up a little early, just in case. That meant I had to sit and stew for an extra few minutes before class started. Miranda, as usual, was the first to arrive. "Hey, Professor Halley," she said brightly. "What are we doing today?" "Reviewing first conjugation verbs," I told her. "And it looks like we'll have a guest today." She brightened even more. "Like that journalist friend you told me about? Or someone else cool?" "Well," I said, "not exactly. I'm, hosting a teaching observation this morning." When I said it like that, it didn't sound so awful. I wasn't sure how aware the students were of the various performance-enhancing protocols we were supposed to go through. Maybe they thought teaching observations were there to observe particularly stellar examples of teaching excellence. "Oh," Miranda's face unbrightened. "Oh, wait. It's not going to be her, is it? Professor DuPont?" "Yup," I said. Miranda and Karen had a history of mutual antagonism and contempt. Karen thought Miranda was an inveterate troublemaker who should be oppressed as much as possible, or possibly expelled. Miranda thought Karen was an asshole. Miranda, I felt, was the better judge of human nature. "I guess we should be on our best behavior then, huh?" "Yep," I said. Miranda set her mouth in a grim line, nodded once like a woman about to perform an unpleasant but necessary task, and sidled around the too-big table to her usual seat by the board. Jackson, slurping loudly on a large iced coffee, came in next, followed closely by Jessica and Isabel. "Professor," Jessica called from across the room, "I think there was a mistake in the quiz." Karen had always shown up late to observations before. Today, she stepped into the classroom at 8:58 a.m., just as Jessica's words filled the too small space. Something like a sour smile crossed Karen's saggy mouth. "Show me," I said to Jessica. I hoped I managed to suppress any kind of nervous glance in Karen's direction as I did so. Jessica flourished her first quiz at me and started talking in an excited mixture of English, Mandarin, and Russian about how I had marked her prepositional case ending wrong for aéroport. "Oh, well, if you remember, aéroport is part of that small class of masculine nouns that take a stressed "oo" ending for the prepositional after "v" or "na," I said. Jessica made a face almost as sour as Karen's and went on a diatribe about Russian case endings. Jessica was one of our Chinese foreign students, whom the university was recruiting more and more to help pay the bills. She was one of those straight-A students who argues over every tiny point off. Normally, I appreciated her zeal. Today, though, she seemed determined to argue extra hard, even though I was clearly right and could point to the exact chart in the textbook to prove it. I could see Karen watching the whole exchange with what looked like delighted schadenfreude. By the time I got Jessica mollified and everyone in their seats and ready to work on first conjugation verbs, it was 9:03. I saw Karen make an emphatic note on her notepad. Her pen made a spine-crinkling little scritch with every stroke. Ugh! I wanted to stop everything and point out that I had been in the classroom talking to a student about a class topic at 9 a.m. exactly. Would it do any good? It would not. I pressed on. The students tried. They tried very hard. These were my second-year kids, who'd been through a trying couple of semesters with me, including hiding behind this very table from an active shooter. I had to assume most of them liked me, or at least we had trauma bonded to an extremely high degree. But Karen's sour smile and the scritch of her pen would have distracted a Zen monk. Jackson, who was the poor unfortunate seated next to her, could hardly manage to look at the board. He alternated between sucking coffee loudly through his straw, rattling his ice, eyeing Karen nervously, and, it seemed to me, trying to read her notes when she wasn't looking. His face, I thought, was turning redder and redder with each sentence. At 8:27, she caught him at it and tried to shift her body to shield her notes from his gaze. But she kept getting distracted and letting the notepad rest uncovered on the table, allowing Jackson another peek at it. Something he saw made a spasm of rage cross his face. "Oh, God," I thought. "Is this going to go on my official performance review? Yes, it is. That way, she can either take credit for improving my previously subpar performance or justify terminating me." I set the students to working on a pair exercise. Jackson partnered up with Isabel, turning his back on Karen. Good, I thought. At least he'll get a few minutes of actual learning in today. Jackson and Isabel began working through the exercise together. Karen said something to them, too low for me to make out. Jackson gave a curt nod and turned away from her. Karen said something again, pointing to Jackson's large takeout cup of iced coffee. Something about the ring of condensation it was leaving on the table, I thought, and how that was interfering with Karen's ability to take notes. Jackson stopped talking to Isabel, turned, and looked at Karen. His eyes flickered up towards me. Something in them alarmed me. They were too resolute. "Jackson," I called. "Why don't you come over?" "Sure," he said, apparently speaking to both me and Karen. "Let me just move my drink real quick." He picked it up. The slippery plastic slid through his fingers, which caught the lid on its way down, tearing it off as the bottom of the cup hit the table. A wave of coffee, cream, syrup, and half-melted ice sloshed over the side and onto Karen's notepad. She emitted an incoherent shriek of horror and grabbed at it. Her right hand connected with the cup, which was balancing precariously on the edge of the table, and swept it right off the table and into her lap, drenching her with a good pint of sticky, icy liquid. Everyone gasped in shock. Karen shrieked again. "Gosh, I'm so sorry," said Jackson. "Here, let me help you clean that up. I've got a packet of tissues on me somewhere." He reached into his backpack. Instead of tissues, though, what he pulled out was a half-eaten pack of peanut butter crackers, which somehow flew out of their cellophane and straight onto the icy pool of coffee rapidly spreading across Karen's skirt and blouse. Karen shrieked again, trying desperately to brush the melting ice and crumbs off her clothes and rescue her notepad. "Let me get that," said Jackson. He grabbed the notepad and ripped off the top several pages. "That should save the rest of it," he said, crumpling up the sodden pages into a ball and tossing it into the trash. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" Karen was making strange little gasps. She looked around the room. 10 pairs of delighted eyes were fixed on her, and 10 mouths struggled to contain their laughter. I'd, thank you. I'd better go get cleaned up. Rowena, I'll see you later. Yes, after I get cleaned up, I'd better." She stood up, dumping ice and crackers all over the floor. She stood there for a moment staring at the mess in stunned perplexity. Then she threw back her shoulders and did her best to march out of the room with dignity. It was badly spoiled by the trail of crumbs and coffee-colored water that dribbled behind her. Chapter 35. The laughter that broke out after she left the room was long, raucous, and loud. "Let's not laugh about it," I said, doing my best to give the students a disapproving look. "She can probably hear us." I remembered leaving the room after the impromptu campus interview at Carmel College last semester and hearing the committee's laughter trailing me down the corridor. I'd never found out whether they'd been laughing at me or at something else. Either way, the memory still haunted me. "She deserved it, Prof," said Jackson. He was grinning broadly. So were all the others. Even Jessica was smiling in delight. "That was real smooth," Miranda told him. "I've never seen such a good accidentally on purpose accident." "My brother and I used to do that kind of stuff all the time," Jackson said. "We got real good at it. First time I've ever used it in a, real-world application, though. What do you think? Do I deserve an Oscar? Best actor in a revenge role? Best accidental special effects?" "For sure," said Miranda. "I think we're out of time," I said. "Jackson, would you mind cleaning up the mess?" "No problem, Prof." During the break between classes, he and Isabel cleaned up the spilled ice and coffee with a cheery efficiency that was only slightly marred by their frequent outbreaks of snorts and giggles. I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. I 100% agreed that Karen deserved it and had done everything she could to bring it down upon herself. And Jackson had indeed been remarkably dexterous and clever, and I couldn't help but admire that. On the other hand, I couldn't condone that kind of thing, and I found myself feeling sorrier and sorrier for her. The second class came in as Jackson and Isabel were dumping their sodden paper towels into the trash. Jackson told them he had accidentally, he waggled his eyebrows as he said it, knocked over his iced coffee, dumping it into Professor DuPont's lap. The second class appreciated this story almost as much as the first class. Karen, it seemed, was unpopular with students all over Crimson. No spectacular accidents happened during the second class, but the aura of the coffee incident made it impossible for anyone to focus. It was a relief to dismiss the students. Or it would have been if it hadn't meant going and facing Karen. She was sitting in her corner office with the door mostly closed. Her voice was subdued when she invited me to come in. Her desk, which, as usual, was piled high with several geological strata of old tests and papers, scraps of notepaper, cough drop wrappers, and random bits of detritus, hid the lower half of her body, but I could see half-dried splash marks all over her blouse. I said, "Are you okay?" "What?" She had been looking at a framed photograph. She placed it face down on a precarious pile of what looked like old gradebooks and focused on me. "Yes, I'm fine, of course, although I have to say, Rowena, this incident only goes to show how unruly and disruptive your classes are." I said. "Although, to be fair, that student, Jackson, is that his name, has a reputation for making trouble. I suppose you can't be held completely responsible for his behavior. Still, we must come up with a plan to bring him under control." I said again. As usual, when dealing with Karen's feedback, I felt like I was being targeted by a rapey pickup artist in a sleazy bar, who was convinced that the way to my heart was by putting me down so that I would fall all over myself letting him help me back up, although not, of course, all the way up to his level. My notes were ruined during the incident, but fortunately, I still remember many of the main points. Let me see. Well, first of all, there's the fact that you were late starting class. Karen went through a litany of my supposed failings, beginning with starting class late, progressing to my teacher-centered mode of lecturing on grammatical points, dwelling on my use of English for explanations, touching upon my use of handwritten Russian on the board, which some of the students had had a hard time reading, and ending with my overly student-centered exercises in the latter half of the class. "Uh-huh," I said. My sense of being targeted by a rapey pickup artist increased. Everything I had done was bog standard, super solid pedagogy for Russian. It wasn't that we didn't try new things, but a lot of the faddish approaches championed by Romance language instructors kept turning out to be failures when it came to Russian. Grammar had to be explained, and it had to be explained in English, and then the students had to be given a certain amount of time to mess around on their own and work through practice exercises. It was also helpful to expose them to handwritten cursive on a regular basis, and let them puzzle through it. Sometimes you could do fun things with authentic materials, but anything too complicated became an exercise in frustration rather than anything constructive. But that left the overseers with little to do, so we had to pretend it wasn't true. And so I need a written response from you, Rowena, by next week. Let's say Monday, shall we? No point in letting it sit around and go stale. Better to work on it while this is all still fresh. So send me a written report by Monday on all these points and how you intend to implement an action plan for improvement. And then we'll hold a follow-up observation. Let's see, in a month? Although this time I think I should observe your other class. I said. I thought about asking how she would know if I'd followed up on my action plan if she observed a different class. Then I decided it was better for everyone if she stayed as far away from Miranda and Jackson as possible. Sure, that sounds good, I said. Just let me know when you want to come by. Yes, yes. Let me look at my calendar for next month. Rather than turning to her computer, she began shuffling through the piles of paper on her desk. She moved the picture off the gradebooks in order to get at something under them, turning it over so that it was now face up. Without consciously meaning to, I looked. The photo showed a vibrantly beautiful young woman, with a wild tangle of auburn curls caught in the wind, and a look of exultant triumph on her face, standing with one fist raised and the other hand holding up a sign that said, "Take back the night, never let the bastards break you." Standing with one arm around her was an equally vibrant woman with an even wilder afro and a sign that read, "Black Feminist Power." Other women were caught in mid-movement in the background, the camera preserving their purposeful, joyful strides long after the event and the women themselves had been forgotten. I must have been staring at the photo too obviously. You know, Rowena, you're not the only academic who can be pretty, Karen said. I was quite the looker back in my day, too. I guess this is what time does to us all. It'll happen to you one day, too, and sooner than you think. Her tone started off full of anticipatory schadenfreude, but by the time she got to the end, it had changed, seemingly against her will, to regretful sadness. I tried not to do too obvious a double take. It was astonishing, and more than that, it was horrifying, to think that this repulsive toad woman in front of me had once been that gloriously happy and alive young woman, her face alight with purpose, her auburn curls streaming in the wind. The physical transformation was shocking enough, but even worse was the mental one. To think that Karen had once been so full of passion and purpose. To think that she had once wanted so openly and obviously to make the world a better place. To think that everything in that picture had been made into a lie, and the bastards had broken her and remade her in their own image. Was that when you were in undergrad? I said. It was the first thing I could think of that didn't involve howls of outrage and horror. First year of grad school, she said. Her expression and her voice were still bittersweet. Delilah and I. Such a beautiful name, Delilah, don't you think? The woman standing next to me. We formed a chapter of campus feminists and started holding events. I don't know what we did right, but for that first year, people kept showing up. Everyone kept telling us what a great thing we were doing. Then they started telling us we needed to focus on our scholarship instead of wasting our time on stuff like that. Delilah said that since she was planning to focus on Black queer feminist studies, activism was part of her scholarship. They washed her out during her comps, told her she wasn't focused and committed enough. I lost track of her soon after that. Once you leave academia, it's like you die for all your friends still in it. So, she went up for her comps ahead of me. She was always so smart, so overprepared for everything. And so, I saw what happened to her, and I said it wasn't going to happen to me. I said I wasn't going to give them any reason to wash me out. And I didn't. And here I am. Oh, I said. Ah, there we are. Karen pulled a desk calendar, marked with numerous coffee cup rings, out from under the grade books, releasing a large cloud of dust and cough drop wrappers. We both broke into a sneezing fit, which in Karen's case morphed into desperate coughing. She fished a half-empty bottle of water out from under another pile of papers, releasing another cloud of dust, and tried to drink from it, but that only made her choke so badly I started to wonder if I needed to attempt a Heimlich. Let's see, she gasped once she could talk again. We're looking at October. I have that retreat. And then it's fall break. And then I'll be conducting oral midterms for my own class, and I won't have time for anything else. And now we're in November, and I've got that conference. We're looking at November now, Rowena. The week of Thanksgiving. Let's make it that Tuesday. I assume you won't be leaving early. No, I said. Tuesday of Thanksgiving week sounds great. Chapter 36. After that, I sat and waited in my office for Mel to be done with her class. I wrote up lesson plans for my classes on Monday, feeling doubt and confusion rise up higher and higher until they threatened to smother me. I was as sure as I could be that my teaching was about as good as it could be, or at least that Karen's suggestions would not improve it. But, as was often the case, receiving any kind of feedback, even feedback that was patently moronic and should be tossed off the steamship of pedagogy without a second thought, had left me confused and demoralized to the point of paralysis. If good teaching was measured by student satisfaction and high learning outcomes, then my best teaching was done when I was left strictly to my own devices. The more people tried to mentor and guide me, the worse my performance became. And Karen's story had been so awful, especially on top of her humiliation this morning. Once again, I couldn't help but agree that she had brought it upon herself, and thoroughly deserved it. If Jackson truly had done it on purpose, I could only sympathize with him and feel that justice had been served. But that didn't make Karen's unhappiness and embarrassment, no matter how richly deserved, any less. And her warning that it will happen to you too, and sooner than you think it will, kept reverberating inside my head, like the ringing from a blocked eardrum that just won't go away. I wasn't so worried about my physical appearance. I knew that we all changed, and one day, providing I didn't get brutally gunned down or something in the meantime, my figure would change and my hair would turn gray and the lines on my face would be visible even in deep twilight. I accepted that, at least as much as anyone could accept that. What I couldn't accept was that I might someday end up like Karen on the inside. She had once been happy. She had once been good. And now she was a force for misery in the world. I figured you had to be bad, somewhere deep down. Frank's parting words joined Karen's spiteful warning in the echoes inside my head. I had tried to shake it off then, just as I wanted to shake off Karen's words too. But I couldn't shake it off completely. There was a grain of truth in what they both had said, a truth that my friends would never admit to, but that my enemies, or at least my non-friends, had apparently seen straight to. My phone pinged. I looked at it, glad for the distraction. It was a message from Madison. "Hey, Professor H. Hope you're doing okay. I wanted to send you something. This is what my cousins and my mom are up to. What do you think? Am I just being crazy? My mom says it's all the drugs I've taken that are messing with me. But I can't stop worrying about it. I saw her post about this yesterday, and it's been eating at me ever since. So I broke down and thought I'd ask you." The message included a link to a website for Glorious Future. Feeling some trepidation, but deciding it would still be better than sitting with my morbid thoughts, I clicked on it. Chapter 37. The website had pictures of broadly smiling blonde children playing soccer, doing handicrafts, and, there in the corner, dressed in camo and carrying guns. 2 of them were holding what I thought were hunting rifles. One was holding what I was pretty sure was an AK-47. Just what everyone needed for a happy and wholesome childhood. There was a link in the menu to a series of blog posts. The most recent post was in English by a Brenda Melnichuk. Madison's mother, I guessed. Melnichuk, if I remembered correctly, was a Western Ukrainian name. It was the equivalent of Miller or Millerson. There were about a bazillion of them all over the former USSR. I started to read. Raising our youth right. So many of us mothers know this heartbreak all too well. We give our children everything, lavish them with all our care, attention, and affection, try to set them up on the path to a good life, and what happens? They reject all our efforts. When this happens, it's easy to blame our children. Why won't they listen to us? Or we can blame ourselves. If only we could find the right way to reach them. We just haven't figured it out yet. But in fact, in most of these cases, there are other forces at work that tear our children away from us and turn them against us. We've talked a lot here about the dangers of modern woke culture being force-fed to our children in schools all over the world. Our children are being taught to love foreigners and hate their own country and their own people, deny they were born a boy or a girl, and turn against their own families. Sometimes it seems like there's nowhere in America left where we can keep our children safe and raise them the right way. That's why I was so glad to connect with my cousins during my trip to Ukraine last year. We had lots of long conversations about lots of interesting things. One of the main things we found out was that we share a lot of the same concerns. All of us see that our children are under constant threat of being taken away from us, by social services serving the big state, or by ideologies that want to turn our children into druggies and hate-filled zombies. I was very excited to find out that my family in Ukraine has already found a solution to this problem. By providing children and teenagers with a supportive atmosphere full of healthy activities that help grow their natural love for their families and their people, they've managed to stop the slide into self-hatred, drug addiction, and sexual impurity. Through Glorious Future, they've started a training camp for young people that helps steer them onto the right path. Young people work one-on-one or in small groups with adults who mentor them. At the Glorious Future camp, many of these mentors have already proved themselves under fire by bravely defending their homeland against the Eastern terrorists as part of the anti-terrorist operation. This naturally makes a big impression on young people, especially teenage boys. Teenage girls also appreciate it too. The admiration they feel naturally translates into obedience and following in their mentor's footsteps. That's why I'm very excited to announce a partnership between Glorious Future and the organization I founded with my good friend Carrie Ostermeyer, Bright Dawn. At Bright Dawn, we hold retreats for people wishing to get in touch with their roots and connect with other like-minded individuals. I'm so excited to let everyone know that a group of mentors from Glorious Future will be joining us for a retreat this winter at the Bright Dawn Retreat Center. If you are interested in attending, contact me directly. I had to agree with Madison that it didn't look great. There wasn't a lot that was blatantly, flagrantly bad, but the whole thing could certainly be read as one giant dog whistle. It also seemed so silly that I had a hard time believing anyone would take it seriously, but lots of people got sucked into things that I considered to be absolutely ludicrous. The attack on woke culture was sure to resonate with lots of people. I could even sympathize on a certain level, although I doubted my critique of woke culture would align very well with theirs. My problem with woke culture was that it prioritized virtue signaling and vitriol over compassion and consensus building. So even though I agreed with many of its basic positions, I disagreed very strongly with its tactics, in the same way that I disagreed with terrorism. And Glorious Future, Bright Dawn, and their ilk, I was perfectly willing to believe, were either feeding into terrorist training camps or were actual terrorist training camps themselves, under the guise of fighting terrorism. The anti-terrorist operation, or ATO, was the Ukrainian name for Kiev's military campaign in the civil war/proxy war currently being fought in the Donbass. Declaring it an operation against terrorism rather than a war garnered lots of U.S. support and, as I understood it, put it on a different legal footing than an actual war. And while some of the people doing the fighting were motivated by simple patriotism or self-defense, others were actively furthering a neo-Nazi agenda. This certainly looked like what Glorious Future and Bright Dawn were doing with their retreats. Terrorist training camps for white supremacists. What could be more delightful? I clicked on the link for the Bright Dawn Retreat Center. Pictures of a pleasant-looking center in the Catskills greeted me. Lots of rustic but still comfortable cabins, picnic pavilions, and glorious fall colors. I could easily imagine it being used as a gathering place for hikers, Girl Scouts, or the more peaceful sort of eco-knitting activists. Several of the buildings had a round symbol of some kind on them. It was out of focus in all the pictures, but it looked similar to the logo of Bright Dawn. I zoomed in on the logo. It was a stylized sun symbol in a cheery yellow with fat, almost childish-looking lines. The sun had your typical points all the way around the outside, like a sun emoji. Inside, in a faint pattern of yellow on yellow that was hard to distinguish, it had a central circle with squiggly rays fanning out to a larger circle. A frisson of revulsion went up the back of my neck. I opened up another browser and searched for Nazi sun symbol. More than 9 million results popped up. I clicked on the Wikipedia page. Their examples were mainly black, with sharp, angular lines that were undeniably fascist in their aesthetic. Bright Dawn's logo was much more reminiscent of Sesame Street than the SS in its initial appearance. But there was still no doubt in my mind that what I was looking at was a Sonnenrad. Chapter 38. I agree that it's potentially concerning, I texted to Madison. Have you reported it to your contact?
What contact?
The person from the FBI who contacted you.
I don't think he was from the FBI, she texted back. Some other alphabet agency.
Well, whoever it was, have you told him about it?
No.
After more than a minute, another text came through.
I'm scared to. What if he laughs at me and tells me it's nothing? Or what if it's something and I get my mom in big trouble?
What if it's something and you don't report it and she gets herself in even bigger trouble? I wrote back.
I still think she'd never forgive me for it.
That was a fair point. This was a horrible situation for Madison to be in. I tried to think of something more morally fraught than stitching on your own mother. Off the top of my head, I couldn't come up with anything other than maybe snitching on your own child. It was not something that was likely to be forgiven, no matter how justified. Why don't I get in touch with my person? I wrote. That way it'll be on me, not you.
Thanks.
No problem, I texted. Happy to help. Then, ignoring the sinking feeling in my stomach, I pulled up Frank on my contacts. He answered on the second ring. Squelching the sinking feeling in my stomach even more, I laid out the situation for him. I know you're probably not the person handling this, and you said you'd take it from here, but I wasn't sure what else to do, I concluded. I didn't want to leave it unreported, in case it really is something.
No, Ro, you did exactly right, he said. I'll make sure it goes to the right people.
Thanks, I said.
Always glad to help.
He sounded more sincere than I had felt when talking to Madison. He sounded more sincere than I felt 95% of the time when I said those words. The thought that Frank might be a more genuine and sincere person than me made my stomach sink even more. I really appreciate it. My mouth felt unpleasantly numb as I said the words. I did appreciate the trouble he was taking, both to help me with Madison's issue and to be nice to me. I also sensed that I was, once again, being insincere. I didn't want to have to appreciate anything Frank did. He laughed in my ear. It was the kind of low, intimate laugh that was so incredibly sexy in a man you were in love with. To my horror, I felt it breathe a little more life into the tiny, tiny spark of attraction I felt towards Frank.
Well, maybe one of these days you'll get a chance to express your appreciation, he said. I'm still hoping we can get you out here to the San Francisco office, Ro.
Yeah, I said. That would be great. Chapter 39. I tried to focus on job applications. No dice. I tried to work some more on the article I'd started last week at Chloe's. Even fewer dice. I tried to do some of my PT exercises. My agitated state meant I hurt myself even more than usual. Get a grip, I told myself. Focus. But it was pointless. Between my meeting with Karen this morning and my conversation with Frank this afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything other than my own self-doubt. What if the man you've been waiting for all this time is Frank? That thought finally rose up from where it had been hiding, deep in the center of my subconscious, and showed itself to me. My first impulse was a wild howl of denial. My second impulse, as was so often the case, was to examine the thought carefully in case it had merit. I certainly had issues in the love department. My entire life, I'd been in exactly 2 serious relationships, both of which had ended with categorical rejection from the other person. Other than that, I'd never really had anything in that area. I'd never even been on a traditional date as such. Men liked to look at me, but they rarely asked me out, and if I asked them out, they recoiled in terror. and I couldn't even complain about it without being accused of being manipulative and selfish. Dima and Alex were both rebels, and I was pretty sure that's one of the things that had drawn us together. They'd been dead set on going against everything that society told them to do, and that included having ordinary relationships with traditional gender roles. But, it had turned out, they hadn't been able to handle any kind of meaningful relationship at all. Frank, on the other hand, was a sexually harassing asshole. But he'd also, I hated even to think it, but it was true, believed in me in a way that neither Dima nor Alex ever had. When we'd been looking for Erin this summer, he'd called me a smarty pants, but that had been his version of a compliment. He'd trusted me to go after her when all Alex had wanted to do was keep me away. I couldn't say that Frank was anyone's knight in shining armor, but he hadn't abandoned me in order to protect me when things got hard. Instead, he'd turned to me for help. Plus, he seemed to subscribe to the idea that a man needed to be in a relationship to be living his best life. And he hadn't run from Erin, even when a person with better sense would have hightailed it in the opposite direction as fast as they could. Maybe he would have run in the end, but I also got the feeling that he wasn't the running kind. Unlike Alex, or Dima. That thought seemed so terrible and disloyal that I felt dirty just thinking it. But it was true. Madison had had to face up to the fact that her mother was engaged in something she found morally abhorrent. I was having to face up to the fact that the men I loved hadn't lived up to my ideal of them. They hadn't been what I'd needed them to be. I'd wanted to be on a happy heroine's journey, where we all worked together to make things better for everyone. They'd seen themselves as on lonely heroes' journeys, where love held them back and the only possible ending was bittersweet at best. I'd bought into that for a long time too, but now I found myself rejecting it fiercely. Part of that was my own brand of idealism. Things should be good for everyone, damn it! Life didn't have to be a zero-sum game. We should be able to find a way to make mutually beneficial agreements. Part of my current rejection was also my increasing understanding of just how much it would cost me to follow their path. My happiness, my self-respect, my chance at having the family I'd always wanted. I'd been bringing it up with Dima ever since we'd gotten engaged, more than 10 years ago. When it had been just a distant fantasy, he'd been excited by the idea, but when I'd actually suggested taking concrete steps to realize it, he'd been against it. Like many other people in my life, he'd told me that having children, especially when I was so young, was selfish and irresponsible. It would ruin my career, be a burden on my colleagues, friends, and family, and make me a less socially engaged person, as well as dramatically increasing my environmental footprint. On some level, I was uncomfortably aware that many of these arguments might be coming from his own selfishness and irresponsibility, but that was too upsetting a thought, so I'd always squelched it. Instead, I'd gone along and believed him when he'd said we should wait, we still had plenty of time. But now, as I slid into the latter half of my 30s, time was growing shorter and shorter. Every time I thought about being single and childless at 40, I felt like a bird of passage trapped in a cage. An unshakable biological imperative was coming up against iron bars. Maybe having a bunch of children was selfish and irresponsible, but what about just one? Just one wouldn't be too bad, would it? Besides, who was going to take care of me in my old age? Some days I found myself wondering if my principled behavior, which had made me reject the age-old ruse of getting pregnant against my male partner's wishes, had backfired on me. Sure, I might have lost Dima if I'd done that. But I'd lost him anyway, and I didn't have a child either. Being a broke and desperate single mother held little appeal, but my current state was so lonely and unfulfilling that I was starting to wonder if the single mom thing might be worth it. To make matters worse, I couldn't even complain about it to anyone. When men say they desperately need sex, they get sympathy, But when women say they desperately need to have a family and children, they're figures of fun. Stop, stop, stop! My throat was actually closing up with unshed tears of self-pity. This was no good. I needed to consider my options and come up with a plan. I considered my options in the man department. Alex seemed like a non-starter. He was way too fucked up to be counted on right now, and maybe ever. He had the basic material to be a good husband and father, but he needed to get his head on straight before he could be counted on. I didn't want to waste any more time on hoping he would pull himself together. Dima was going to do what Dima was going to do. He had lots of good basic material, too, I was sure of that. But I should know by now not to build anything with him as its foundation. Everything I'd said about Alex was true for Dima as well, but squared, or possibly cubed. As for Frank, I reluctantly admitted to myself that, of the three of them, he might actually be my best bet. I suspected that his basic material was much less good than Alex or Dima's. But I also suspected that if I played my cards right, I would have much better luck at actually getting him to marry me and even provide me with children. Sure, I figured there was at least a 50% chance that he'd cheat on me, and a 75% chance that we'd make each other unhappy, but the woman with the ring on her finger and the charming pets and 2.1 beautiful children in her pleasant family home would be me. That didn't sound like healthy thinking at all. Although it did sound like a lot of the thinking that those of us on the marriage market were supposed to do. Weren't we supposed to reject unrealistically high standards and take what we could realistically get? That to me sounded like more of the warm body fallacy that our society was currently so immured in, where everyone was fungible and all you had to do was find anyone with a pulse in order to plug them into your impersonal system. At least until the long-promised AI developments allowed us to do away with actual people entirely and just have digital avatars. But I had never found that people were fungible and replaceable. For me, no matter how much I might wish it weren't true, each person was unique, and the people who really mattered for me personally were few and far between. Realistically, I was never going to be happy with just anyone just because we had a few similar life goals. Realistically, no matter how large a gaping hole their absence was leaving in my life, the ring on my finger and 2.1 beautiful children would never be enough to make up for the misery of being with the wrong person. I'd read enough literature from the arranged marriage, pre-divorce era to know that those kinds of relationships often ended in tragedy for the whole family. And while I might be engaging in wild fantasies of normalcy and domesticity right now, they were, in fact, unrealistic. Realistically, I had never been able to manage normalcy. Realistically, I had been born to be extreme one way or another, and I wasn't going to be able to change that aspect of myself, no matter how much I might want to. Besides, I told myself more optimistically, I had more than just 3 options. The rise of dating apps meant that I had literally countless options. In theory, there were thousands of others at least as extreme as I was, just waiting to meet me and declare me their soulmate. In theory. In practice, I was more doubtful. But it seemed like, desperate as I was, maybe I should at least look at what was out there. I took a few deep breaths to psych myself up. My knowledge of men was deep rather than wide. Well, that was about to change. Internet dating was probably going to be some kind of Brothers Karamazov dive into the pettiness of the human spirit. I flexed my fingers. I could handle it, right? I'd faced down loads of things much scarier and darker than a bunch of dating profiles. I could do this. I could! It could even lead to something new and wonderful in my life. Maybe, I thought, if I kept telling myself that, it would be true. Chapter 40. Some internet research told me that I could pay upwards of $50 a month for some of the dating apps. Welcome to capitalism, I said. Apparently, money could buy you love. Although that had always been true. Maybe my problem was a lack of money. Maybe Mel was right, and I should blame myself less and misogyny and late-stage capitalism more. In fact, I was sure she was right. But since I still had to exist in a society ruled by misogyny and late-stage capitalism, I had to figure out how to optimize my results given the constraints in which I was operating. Given those constraints, paying $50 to $100 a month for the chance to have my profile shown to people who might be total psychopaths, or at least hopeless dead ends, was not an option. Feeling tearful and faintly queasy, I started a profile on a free app. It took way longer than I had been expecting and asked a number of what I considered rather impertinent questions. I supposed this was good information to have in these kinds of situations, but it also made me wonder how many of the people were here for cheap hookups. Lots, I concluded. I went to bed wondering how many messages from sexual predators I could expect to wake up to. To my surprise, there was only one message from an obvious hookup artist waiting for me the next morning. What there was that I had not been expecting were 5 other messages from obviously fake profiles. Grimly, I sat down and went through some profiles myself, dutifully messaging those with a match rating of 90% or higher. Boy, did this feel like work. Also, the closest person lived in Atlanta, an hour and a half away. It's still closer than California or Russia, I told myself. And you can't expect instant results. Everything takes work. That work was so dispiriting, though, that it was actually a relief to turn to working on my first job application. I updated my CV to reflect my teaching experience over the summer and swapped out the cut-and-paste sentences in my cover letter to say exactly what particular thing at that particular institution I would be happy at the beginning of the letter, or even delighted at the end of the letter, to do. Then I paid the necessary fees to have my confidential letters of recommendation forwarded to the institution, and $18 later, sat back with a sense of a dirty deed done well. The rest of the afternoon dragged. After spending the summer with Alex, and then Madison's impromptu sleepover, living by myself felt lonely and boring. I had Fevronia, of course, but she only tolerated about 7 minutes of contact, max, before she turned on me with a whirlwind of fangs and claws. I could no longer go running or do yoga or hapkido, and my PT exercises took less than half an hour. In theory, I had an infinite amount of work I could do on my latest article, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Somehow, Marina Tsvetaeva's 1913 poem, Passerby Who Looks Like Me, felt distant and unimportant right now. I mean, I knew that on the grand scale of things, it was a work of timeless significance. But right now, I was having a hard time focusing on it. The result was that I spent the last part of Saturday afternoon reading about Bright Dawn, Brenda Melnichuk's organization. It was enlightening, to say the least. Bright Dawn had been founded 5 years ago as a partnership between Brenda and a woman named Carrie Ostermeyer. Carrie Ostermeyer, I discovered after a little digging around, was part of a wealthy New York family with ties to the Republican Party. She did not, as far as I could tell, have a job as such, but after some kind of youthful indiscretion that was hinted at in the articles but never explained straight out, she had devoted herself to philanthropical work, with at-risk youth as her primary focus. She and Brenda, who had a background in hospitality, had joined forces in 2011 to create a retreat/outdoor center for at-risk youth and their families to connect with each other against the healing background of the natural beauty of the Catskill Mountains. That all sounded lovely. It sounded so sickeningly sweet and sincere that I started to experience doubts. Maybe I was totally misreading things. Maybe Gloria's Future was itself innocent, or Bright Dawn's connection with it was, and what I thought was a Sonnenrad in the logo was pure coincidence and me seeing things that weren't there. Maybe it was intuition that made me keep reading. Maybe it was an intense dislike of being wrong. Either way, by supper time I had read a short statement by Brenda saying they had chosen the name Bright Dawn to signify the new beginnings for the struggling families that they aimed to nurture, and also because of the similarities with the beautiful name Golden Dawn. A little more looking told me that Golden Dawn could refer to an early 20th century secret society dedicated to the occult, or it could refer to a current neo-Nazi Greek political organization. There was nothing from Brenda's statement that allowed me to guess which one she meant, or if she was referring to something else entirely. Over the next several days, when I wasn't teaching, working on job applications, or grimly liking men on the dating app who never liked me back and blocking the scammers who kept messaging me, I continued reading about Brenda, Carrie, Bright Dawn, Glorious Future, and the alt-right, white supremacist, and neo-Nazi movements in North America and Europe. By the end of the week, I was convinced that Madison was absolutely right to be concerned. My main fear was that she wasn't concerned enough. As often happened when delving into fringe movements, I was disconcerted by how much I had in common with them. I had been brought up on the fringes myself, and although I had taken a few steps towards integrating myself into mainstream society, I still saw it largely from the perspective of an outsider looking in. This meant that I often had a lot in common with people who'd grown up in the mainstream and then become disillusioned with it. I noticed it before with evangelical Christians and anti-vaxxers. Although I didn't share many of the fundamentals of their movements, I did share some of their critiques of modern-day America. It was a society that had lost its moral compass, with a medical system that was more concerned with turning a profit than helping people. I just disagreed with the means that those particular groups took to rectify the situation. I had always assumed, though, that I would have absolutely nothing in common with neo-Nazi extremists. That was completely beyond the pale. But no, we both, it seemed, felt like we were living in a crumbling empire careening towards dystopia. Many alt-right or neo-Nazi extremists had been radicalized by their hatred of the Iraq War or their concerns about climate change. I shared both of those feelings. I just thought that using violence to create a white ethno-nation would almost certainly cause us to plunge into dystopia even faster and deeper. In the case of Brenda, she made frequent posts on social media about the need to protect our youth from dangerous outside influences and the harmful effects of modern drug culture. Given that she was Madison's mother, I could see why she would feel that way. Her hatred of drugs had then extended out to drug dealers, whom she apparently saw as being largely black or Mexican. She kept her public statements about them fairly veiled, but I gathered that she was edging ever closer to full-on white supremacy as her rage against drugs and drug culture grew. As for Glorious Future, it held the same position as most of the rising right-wing groups from Central and Eastern Europe. They were the last bulwark against the tide of degenerate liberalism coming from Western Europe and the barbaric Asiatic hordes of Russia. The fact that there was an actual war with pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass only strengthened their conviction that they were the last stand of European civilization. Their message, it seemed, had resonated with Brenda, and she had brought it back to Carrie Ostermeyer, who had also found it attractive. Now Bright Dawn was pivoting to a more hard-line alt-right/neo-Nazi agenda, while still packaging itself as a cheery, family-friendly nature retreat for healthy outdoor activities. I had to admire their strategy, although I wasn't sure how conscious it was. Neo-Nazism had always been very male-dominated, as far as I knew, and had a hard time recruiting women. But Brenda and Carrie, with their unaggressive, almost childish logos and statements, were making it seem like something that women, even women who abhorred violence and macho posturing and only cared about nurturing their families, might want to get involved in. The only thing I didn't know was how dangerous their current plans were. Maybe they were just a couple of crackpots who weren't actually going to do anything that bad and could be left alone, like a slow-growing tumor that it would be more dangerous to remove. It was a comforting thought. I just hoped it wasn't wishful thinking.